Rosie, why do we have a Federal Reserve? What the heck did they do? And more importantly, how did they come about? And, well, how about they today in the role that so many people are against the United States Federal Reserve? But at the end of it, we'll ask a question that nobody can really answer, which in effect will prove why we really need a Federal Reserve. We don't need all the functions that they may do, but we sure need a Federal Reserve. Let's get into the reason why, because everybody needs to know this. And a very good morning to you. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe bell and subscribe and the bell for all notifications. We do a lot of things on here. We do a deep dive on economics and try to simplify things. Also politics, but in addition, we do fun things, vintage audio, metal detecting, live streaming, as well as demonstration cooking and travel. Love you to be a part of it, so make sure you subscribe and hit that bell for all notification. One of the things we enjoy is having intelligent conversation, and as I said, simplifies things so that people can understand. Grab a cup of coffee. Let's get into it. Now, the history of the United States has been replete with booms and busts and panics. 1828 bank panics. There were panics after the Civil War regarding the gold market, and there were panics in the 1880s and contractions. We only ever really hear about the Great Depression. But in fact, phenomena and booms and busts were a feature of the United States economic landscape as it grew over the years. Well, by the turn of the 20th century, the United States economy had grown so large due to railroads, the invention of motor cars, and now there were consumer goods starting to come on the market that literally the economy was exploding, and the GDP, the gross domestic product, was going through the roof. As a result, the exchanges through the monetary systems often struggled to keep pace with demand, and interest rates would sort of govern that, right? Well, going into 1907, what became known as the Knickerbocker Panic of 1907, there were very easy money conditions as we see today. But just like today, just like in the 1800s, just like in 8000 BC, some people tended to be greedy and they wanted a little more out of the cookie jar than the cookie jar was willing to go at that time. Back in 1907, there was a company called United Copper Company, and copper was all the rage. You can imagine with electricity coming into use, the demand for copper wire and stuff was absolutely through the roof. So a lot of people were interested, particularly in Wall Street, in copper. And once in a while, people would try to corner a stock. That means they would get together in a back room, usually with big cigars and a couple drinky poos, sit in the back room and say, you know, if we pulled all of our resources together, we could probably buy every, 50.01% of the stock, and we could take control of this company. Why don't we all put our money into the pool, right? And we'll start secretly buying. We'll have Fred at Mercer Brokerage House start to buy quietly, of course, right? And then the price starts to go up. And then when it hits a certain peak, they'll unload it on what they call the suckers, and that it'll collapse, right? It's called a collapsing corner, and that's exactly what happened to United Copper Company in 1907. Now, the big wigs in the back room with the cigars and the brandy and whatever didn't often use all their own money. They would have relationships with banks because they were rich. They'd go in and tell the banker, look, man, I want to borrow money to buy some stock. Maybe the banker would be in on it. Okay, right. All right, don't tell anybody. I'm going to give you guys 10 million bucks. So there was also bank money that was involved in this, in funding some of these corners. And in the case of United Copper, as the price went up, everything was great. But Banks lend you and they expect interest, and the period of easy money was coming to an end as demand for credit soared. Interest rates in the free market, there was no Federal Reserve at that time. It was banks to banks setting those rates by their own people and coming to a common consensus in money markets in places like New York City, London, and other places around the globe of what the interest rates would be. Well, the cost to carry this United Copper corner failed because they could never get enough of control, because as it goes higher, it becomes more expensive to buy the number of shares needed. And eventually, of course, like anybody's human, some people are going to bail out of the nice arrangement. They're going to sort of cash in ahead of time and leave the other guys. Everybody wants to leave the other guy holding the bag, like a merry-go-round, right? So what happens is this corner collapses in United Copper and the price just implodes downward. Well, these guys have tar on their fingers with shares stuck to them that they can't unload at a reasonable price, and pretty soon it's like, boys, our goose is cooked, it's over. And they got to go to the banks and say, well, the banks already know, of course, that we screwed up, okay? We're not going to be able to pay you back. Well, for a lot of these banks, that's not something that people want to hear, particularly depositors. No FDIC insurance, no credit union insurance, no state insurance. Full faith and credit in the bank's pledge your money will be safe. Well, when people caught wind that the Knickerbocker Trust Company was one of the principal lenders of this failed corner in United Copper Company, smart people said, oh man, they started doing a back of the envelope calculation and seeing how much money was potentially lost, and they made their way into the bank and started to withdraw their money. Well, like anything else, word spreads, right? Oh, did you hear? Knickerbocker Trust is gone down, man. They got busted up in that corner in United Copper. Well, by the end of the afternoon, in October of 1907, here comes Grandma in to get her $17 out of the bank. And guess what? The door's closed. Sorry, we're closed for the day. We're going to be undergoing reorganization, and well, yeah, okay, we screwed up. So what are you going to do? Well, a lot of people got hurt. But to quell that panic at that particular time, you have to understand, as I said before, banks were lending money, and they had the right to charge whatever they want. There was no lender of last resort with a window that you could go to as a bank and say, gee, I need 10 million short term to cover, right, to stem the panic, right? Interest rates started to soar, and believe it or not, at the very peak of the panic, they soared to 100% in the money markets. That's 100% per year interest they were charging. Why? Because the risk is so high. Right? When risk is high, people want to extract the most because there's a good chance they might not get their money back. And that's what interest rates do. They act like a governor on that. Anyway, these banks couldn't hope. One bank run started to spread to another, and this bank would call, the Bank of New York and say, look, man, I need to borrow $20 million. The savages are at the door with pitchforks and torches. You got to help me out. Okay, man, I'm going to charge you 27%. Good, no problem. And another bank calls, and by this time it's worse and worse. And they call up the borrowing bank. Man, Bank of New York calls. I need some more money. It's like, dude, it's going to be 80%. 80%. You can see why these high interest rates would have had a ripple effect in the economy, especially to Joe Merchant down the road who has to borrow money for funding his inventory for Christmas and stuff like that. And pretty soon the panic got so out of hand that interest rates hit 100%, as you can see by this chart below. Well, this was pretty much unprecedented in modern finance, and people looked around from bank to bank in New York City, thought to themselves, we can't solve this thing, man. We just can't. We can't do the interest rates. We got more and more depositors heading down. As you can see this picture on Wall Street, heading down to get money out of the banks. They're getting ready to raid the exchange. It's going to be like barbarians at the gate here. Finally, they found one particular settled one particular person that might have the financial resources to stem the panic, and that was J.P. Morgan of Morgan, Bank of Morgan. So the bankers, the other bankers went hat in hand, right? Get scolded by J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan announces that I will make the funds available at X money, a much lower rate, and all the money you need to borrow to get out of this panic. And the panic was over. The run stopped. Things became reorganized, but the bitter aftermath of that experience led Congress to do some serious investigating, as well as the banking commissioner of New York. So they met various times through the 1920s after the First World War, and they decided to form an organization that would be that lender of last resort if the stuff hit the fan and everybody else pulled in because they were scared out of their minds to lend money because they might go down the tubes too. Now you could go to a window and borrow what monies you needed at a reasonable interest rate from the Federal Reserve. And that was the primary purpose of why the Federal Reserve was put into action. It was an association of member banks that would join together, and they would have regional offices throughout the nation: Kansas City, Dallas, San Francisco, Denver, Philadelphia, Boston, etc., etc. And they would work cooperatively to make sure that monies were available, so we would never have that type of panic again. Well, over time, that worked reasonably well, and having that lender of last resort gives a certain amount of comfort to people in an economy. And we've seen it work during the real estate crisis of 2008, right, where the Federal Reserve helped engineer easy money by buying in crappy loans, mortgage loans, collateralized mortgage obligations that weren't collateralized at all, working with the United States Treasury, and were able to turn that situation around over a period of years. In other words, they became the buyer of last resort in taking off all those crappy loans at that particular time. Their mandate is also expanded to work towards full employment. But we have to bear in mind here that the lender of last resort doesn't mean that things can't hit the fan. All through the 1920s, as you see in this chart, interest rates went down, the 10-year, the T-bill rates went down, down, down. That era of cheap money, of course, created a dramatic run-up in all asset classes, right? From real estate to stocks, everybody wanted to get on board because it was a time for cheap borrowing and everybody could afford anything, new consumer products. Well, the window of last resort didn't matter when prices got so high that they collapsed in October, November of 1929. And in the ensuing 3 years until June, July of 1932, stocks lost 90% of their value. The air had gone out of the balloon. And all that the Federal Reserve could do was keep interest rates low. But people had been so blown out by overconsumption, by high prices, and locked into loans and things like that, that things just came to a screeching halt. So the Federal Reserve can be operative in times of panic, but they can't stop economic situations from deteriorating in the future. This should be a big lesson to us, having come through basically a 45, 50-year period of easy, 40-year period of easy money here. They culminated in interest rates basically less than 1% for the 10-year bond. That has certain implications for oversucking people into the vortex of borrowing. It also has the effect of driving up the cost of things to a point where something has to give. Will something have to give in the future? That's a topic for another conversation, and I hope you'll subscribe to hear that too. In closing now, you have a good idea why the Federal Reserve came into existence and was signed in by President Wilson in 1913 into law. Some people say it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, but generally if something is passed by the Congress of the United States, at least, it has a pretty good chance of being viewed as legal and constitutional. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I hope you learned a little something about it, why we have a Federal Reserve, and the important role that the Federal Reserve must continue to play. The question I said I would ask at the end is, if not the Federal Reserve, who or what do you expect to step in if interest rates once again soar? Because risk is exploding in the markets and in the economy. There's a reason interest rates are rising now, even though the Federal Reserve is cutting short-term rates. Maybe it's the canary in the coal mine that's warning us that 6% level, if it's breached, right now we're at 4.5%. If that 6% level is breached, you can expect that there will be hell to pay. In closing it out, thanks so much for watching today. Your thumbs up are appreciated. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think, and enjoy the rest of your day. See you down the road.